Theodore and Hank were bringing a cargo ship named Catherine into the big harbor. Theodore was the tug in charge. That meant he was up in front, leading the way and giving the orders. Theodore always felt important when he was the tug in charge. Theodore gave 2 stern blasts of his whistle to warn Hank he was about to start turning. "Why, that is the cutest little whistle," said Catherine. "My whistle isn't cute or little," said Theodore. "My whistle is fresh," suggested Hank. It was the only word he could think of just then. Well, by the time they reached the dock, Theodore had a big frown. After all, he was an important tug in charge, and he didn't think an important tug in charge should have a cute little whistle. After he had finished moving Catherine, Theodore couldn't stop thinking about his whistle. That was Emily's whistle. Now to Theodore, Emily's whistle always sounded confident. It seemed to say, "I'll handle this." Theodore cleared his smokestack and blew his best whistle. But to Theodore, his whistle said, "Ordinary." "My whistle isn't good enough," he thought. Theodore wanted his own special whistle. He decided to make his whistle sound just like Emily's. Theodore blew and blew his whistle, trying to make it sound confident like Emily's. "What do you think?" he said. "Well," Emily wondered why Theodore was making that strange sound. "I think you should go to the repair yards," she said. "There may be something stuck in your smokestack." Not long after, Theodore spied Foduck passing by on his harbor safety patrol. Foduck whistled to let everyone know he was on the job. To Theodore, Foduck's whistle sounded very serious. It said, "I'm doing important things." Theodore decided that maybe his whistle should sound like Foduck's. Theodore blew and blew, trying to make his whistle sound serious and important. "Bat!" cried Foduck. "It sounds like there's a giant bat in the harbor. I better warn everyone." "Did he say my whistle sounded like a bat?" frowned Theodore. Hank was just getting ready to pull Bobby Barge when Theodore came floating along. Hank let out a loud whistle as he got underway. Now to Theodore, Hank's whistle sounded larger than life. "I'm ready for anything," it seemed to say. And Theodore decided that maybe his whistle should sound more like Hank's. "Hank, wait a minute," he called. Theodore blew, and he blew his whistle, trying to make it sound larger than life. "Well," asked Theodore, after he had finished whistling for Hank, "what do you think of my new whistle? Is it bigger or just better?" Hank looked blank. But then, seeing how discouraged Theodore looked, he said, "It's bigger and better. It's bitter. No, it's butter. It sounds fresh." Theodore continued along his way home when he saw George moving Owen the oil rig. Well, George gave a bumper-rattling blast with his whistle. To Theodore, George's whistle sounded big and brash and bold. It announced to all the world, "Make way for me." George has the very best whistle of all, thought Theodore. So Theodore decided to make his whistle sound just like George's. Theodore took his windiest breath, made his best whistling face, puckered his lips, and let out all his air with a great whoosh. The big harbor shook with the mighty sound of nothing. Not a sound. Not a peep. Not even a little bird's tweet. Theodore had worn out his whistle. That afternoon, the tugboats were gathered at the great ocean dock. The dispatcher was about to make a surprise announcement.
Tugboats,
The dispatcher began.
this afternoon a very special guest is arriving in our harbor. The great ocean liner, the Queen Stephanie.
The tugs were thrilled to hear this. The Queen Stephanie was the grandest ocean liner in the world. She visited the harbor every now and then. And when she did, it was always a special event.
Everyone shipshape?
Asked the dispatcher. The tugs all whistled. Yes, sir. One by one. All except Theodore.
Theodore,
Said the dispatcher.
all shipshape?
I can't whistle, Theodore said in a voice the dispatcher could hardly hear. Well, the dispatcher said nothing for the longest moment. And then he turned so that only Theodore could hear. Theodore, tugs must have whistles if they want to work. No, I'm sorry, but I can't send you out with the other tugs to bring in the Queen Stephanie today. Well, Theodore knew the dispatcher was right, but it didn't make it any easier. He wanted to help bring in the Queen more than anything. The other tugboats set off to meet the Queen Stephanie. Soon a mighty horn was heard, echoing across the water. Theodore could see all the other tugs greeting the Queen without him. It all started because I didn't like my whistle, Theodore thought sadly. And now I don't have any whistle at all. The sun had almost set by the time the tugs finished bringing in the Queen Stephanie. They returned to the great ocean dock, tired but excited, and talking loudly about the Queen. She really is the nicest ship, said Emily. She's so kind.
Very modern,
Said Photo.
very big.
Trumpeted George. Very fresh, exclaimed Hank. Well, that was the only word he could think of, and it sounded great. Hearing how wonderful it all was just made Theodore feel even worse about missing his chance to bring in the great ship. Emily floated quietly over to Theodore. The Queen Stephanie was asking about you, she said. She was? Said Theodore. What did she want? What did she say? What did you tell her? Oh, tell me, Emily. She asked me where you were, said Emily. She did? Said Theodore. Yes, continued Emily. I think you should go over and say hello. Do you think it's okay? Said Theodore. Sure, replied Emily. Even though you can't work without your whistle, you can still visit. A little later, Theodore set off to see the Queen Stephanie. It was dark by now. The harbor lights were winking all around him. Why was the Queen asking about me? Theodore wondered. The closer Theodore got to the Queen Stephanie, the louder his heart seemed to pound. He was sure the whole harbor could hear it. And then he saw her. Theodore couldn't help but gasp out loud. Oh, what a sight she was. Her lights reflected in the water, and she swayed slightly in the nighttime tide so that she seemed to be suspended in the sky itself. To Theodore, oh, she looked like a great floating palace. Theodore, said the Queen, surprised, I'm very glad to see you. I missed you today. When Theodore heard this, he felt sad. I'm sorry I couldn't help bring you in, he said. But, well, you see, I wore out my whistle. Wore out your whistle? Said the Queen. Oh, that really is too bad. Your whistle is so bright and cheerful, just like you are. It is? Said Theodore. I mean, I am? Theodore frowned a little. I didn't think you even noticed my whistle. Oh, I most certainly do, said the Queen. Even when I can't see tugboats buttoned on way below me, I can always hear their whistles and tell exactly who they are by their sound. Oh, every tugboat has their own special whistle. Even Me? Said Theodore. Oh, I should say so, said the Queen brightly. Your whistle is the most special thing about you. My whistle? Said Theodore. Of course, replied the Queen. Your whistle always makes me smile. Well, Theodore was silent. He was thinking about everything the Queen was saying. And somehow, just hearing her words made him feel much better about his whistle. I'm sure you'll get your whistle back soon, said the Queen. It just needs a little rest. And so do I, she yawned. It's getting late. Good night, Theodore. Good night, said Theodore. Theodore headed home, taking his time. It had seemed like a magical night, and he didn't want it to end just yet. The Queen, Stephanie, really was the nicest ship. It seemed she always knew just the right thing to say. Had she really said that his whistle was bright and cheerful and that it made her smile? I guess my whistle is special, Theodore thought. The night was clear and starry, and there was a gentle tang of salt sea air in the breeze. And Theodore felt happy. Then softly, so softly, he took a breath and let out a small, sweet, wonderful whistle. His good old Theodore whistle. And he just had to smile. Rough weather was blowing up and down the coast, and a blanket of thick fog hung over the harbor. The dispatcher called all the tugs into the great ocean dock. Theodore was the last to return. He had a very strange look on his face. Is something the matter, Theodore? Asked Emily. I think, said Theodore, catching his breath, I think I saw a ghost. A ghost? Said Foduck. What did he look like? Asked Hank. Tell us, Theodore. I didn't really see it that well, explained Theodore. It was out near Shipwreck Rock. I saw a small ship. That is, it looked like a ship, only it was a ghost. Well, how did you know it was a ghost? Said Hank. It made a strange sound, said Theodore. Ding, ding. Hank was so startled he bumped right into George. I could see right through it, said Theodore. And it was floating in the air above the water. There are no such things as ghosts, snorted George. You probably just saw a big wave from the storm. When the other tugs heard that, they were very relieved. George is right, said Foduck. It was just a big wave. George is always right, added Hank. George felt good. It felt good being the tug who was always right. But Theodore was still upset. I did see a ghost ship, he said quietly. I know I did. Just then, the dispatcher turned to George and said, George, I have reports the storm has blown trees into the water near Shipwreck Rock. That could be dangerous for ships. Please proceed there immediately, then report back to me. George headed towards Shipwreck Rock on the edge of the big harbor. He was going along slowly, checking for trees in the water. It grew very quiet, except for the sound of the distant foghorn on Willie's Island. What was that? George heard a strange sound, like a small bell. Ding, ding. He floated a little closer. It was a small ship, but not like any ship he had ever seen before. Its mast was cracked and crooked, and its hull was rotten and rusty. George thought he could see right through it. But the strangest thing of all was that The ship seemed to be floating in the air above the water. And it seemed to be calling to him. "Ghost!" cried George. "Ghost!" And he turned and headed for home as fast as his engine would take him. The dispatcher wanted to send the tugs out to work again, but he was waiting to hear from George to see if the harbor was safe and clear of dangerous trees. George hurried towards the dock, looking very worried. "You look like you've seen a ghost," grinned Emily. The other tugs all smiled, too. All except for Theodore. Theodore knew he had seen a ghost out there.
George, said the dispatcher, is the harbor safe? Are there any trees in the water?
Well, George didn't know what to say to the dispatcher. He couldn't say the harbor was safe, not with that ghost out there. But he had said there were no such things as ghosts, and after all, he was the tug who was always right.
Well, sir,
George began.
I'm not sure. I think I'd better have another look at that ghost. I mean, the coast. Very well, George, said the dispatcher. This time, I would like Theodore to go with you. Take the salvage barge to collect anything dangerous you find in the water. That is all.
But, stammered George, Theodore can't come with me.
Why not?
Frowned the dispatcher.
Because,
said George,
because the harbor is safe. I spoke too soon. I spoke too soon. George, said the dispatcher,
quickly losing his patience.
First, you said you weren't sure if it was safe, and now you say it is. You will leave immediately with Theodore and not waste any more time. That is all.
George set off feeling miserable. He wished he hadn't been so quick to tell Theodore that he was wrong about the ghost. Then he wouldn't be going out again right now. Out to where George was sure the ghost was waiting for him. George led the way towards Shipwreck Rock, with Theodore pulling Bobby Barge in his salvage crane. It was getting late in the day. The pea-soup fog was hanging even lower over the harbor. We're almost at Shipwreck Rock, Theodore thought to himself worriedly. That's where I saw the ghost. George was worried, too.
I hope I don't see the ghost,
he thought to himself. And then he had an even worse thought.
I hope Theodore doesn't see the ghost. I told him there are no such things as ghosts, and I'm the tug who is always right. Theodore, said George out loud, you wait here. I'll check to see if the ghost is clear. I mean coast. There may be some big trees in the water that were hit by lightning. I mean lightning.
George headed towards Shipwreck Rock. But as soon as he was out of sight of Theodore, George stopped his engine and just floated silently, listening. Foghorn? Seagull? Waves in the rocks. George was naming all the sounds he heard, all the good old familiar, not a ghost sounds. Meanwhile, Theodore floated along by himself, naming all the things he saw, all the good old, familiar, not a ghost things. Shadows, dock, a scary rock.
Another foghorn, said George. Boat whistle. Ghost. Ghost!
Shouted George. That strange sound belonged to the ghost. George raced to where he had left Theodore. Theodore was nowhere to be found. Then George had a terrible thought. Maybe Theodore saw the ghost. Or maybe the ghost saw Theodore. Suddenly something bumped right into him.
Oh!
Cried George. Then he saw it was Theodore.
Where were you?
Asked George.
I was worried about the ghost,
admitted Theodore.
I did see one, even if you don't believe me. Well, I've inspected everything,
Frowned George.
And the ghost is clear. I mean, the coast.
What was that? Said Theodore. There was that strange sound again. Ding, Ding! And it was much closer now. The tugs realized with a shudder they were almost at Shipwreck Rock.
Theodore,
Said George, looking very unhappy.
I have something to tell you.
And then, again, there was a strange sound. It was very close now, and it seemed to be calling them.
What were you going to tell me?
Whispered Theodore.
Tell you?
Said George.
You had something to tell me?
Repeated Theodore.
Ghost!
Cried George.
Ghost!
Cried Theodore.
Come on, Theodore!
Just then they heard
Theodore! Theodore!
the ghost was calling Theodore.
It knows your name,
Said George.
I know that voice.
Said Theodore. And gathering his courage, he called,
Digby? Is that you?
Yes, it is.
called Digby the cable ship.
The ghost's name is Digby?
Said George.
That's not a very scary name.
Theodore remembered Digby. He was an old cable ship who lived near Shipwreck Rock. Just then, the fog lifted a bit, and the tugboats could see that Digby was sitting right up on top of Shipwreck Rock.
So it isn't a ghost,
Said Theodore.
You were right all along,
George. Now, George was about to say that Theodore had been right about the ghost. But now, there was no ghost. That meant George could still be the tug who was always right. So George didn't say anything. Theodore turned to Digby.
Well, how did you get up there?
A big wave washed me up here during the storm.
Explained Digby.
Now I'm stuck.
We thought, Theodore thought
Said George.
that you were a ghost.
Yes, agreed Theodore sadly. With the fog all around, it looked like you were floating in the air above the water.
Well, I wish I could float in the air.
Groaned Digby.
How will I ever get down from this rock?
Well, Theodore had an idea. It was getting late, and the other tugs were wondering where George and Theodore were.
There they are.
Shouted Fodak. Theodore was pulling Bobby Barge, and right beside him, George was pulling Digby,
Digby the cable ship was stuck on Shipwreck Rock,
explained George.
and we got him down with the crane. Good work,
Said the dispatcher.
We were getting worried about you. In fact, we had almost given up the ghost.
Theodore had a very sad look on his face. George was right, he said. There really was no ghost. It was just Digby. George could see how upset his friend Theodore was, and suddenly he knew he had something to say. He took a deep breath,
I thought there was a ghost, too.
said George.
When I was out near Shipwreck Rock,
He began.
the sky was filled with big, dark clouds. When suddenly, I heard a strange sound.
Sound? Chattered Hank. What kind of sound?
Ding, ding.
Shouted George. Hank was so startled, he bumped right into Emily. The other tugs had to laugh. George told everyone the rest of his ghost story, which really wasn't a ghost story. And do you know something? George found out it didn't feel so bad being the tug who was sometimes wrong. Not so bad at all.